My husband's revenge stunned everyone after catching me in bed with another man. What would you do if the person you betrayed became the one pulling the strings of your downfall? This story explores love, betrayal, and the unexpected twists that follow. Stay tuned and let me know where you're watching from. Setup: 1,000 words. My husband James and I always appeared to have the perfect life. From the outside, we were the quintessential suburban couple: a charming house, weekend barbecues with friends, and shared laughter at dinner parties. But the truth? It was far more complicated than it seemed. James had been my rock for 10 years. When we first met, he was ambitious but warm, always making time for me despite his busy career as an investment manager. We shared dreams of traveling the world, building a family, and growing old together. I believed we were unbreakable, but somewhere along the way, cracks began to form. His career demanded more of him as he climbed the corporate ladder, and he became consumed with work. Late nights at the office turned into weekends away for business trips. He was providing for us, but at what cost? The man who used to bring me flowers just because now barely. I told myself it was just a phase, that once his work settled down, we'd reconnect. But weeks turned into months, and the distance between us grew wider. I felt like a shadow in my own marriage, going through the motions of daily life while James's world spun at a different speed. Loneliness crept in, filling the empty spaces James used to occupy. I tried to talk to him about it, but every conversation ended the same way, with him apologizing and promising to make more time for us. Promises that he never kept. Then there was Matt. Matt was a neighbor we had known for years. He lived 3 doors down, always the life of the party at our neighborhood gatherings. He was charming in a way James wasn't, more casual, more present. We started running into each other at the gym, and then it turned into quick chats at the local coffee shop. At first it was harmless, a smile here, a shared joke there. But the more time I spent around Matt, the more I realized how much I craved attention. Any attention that I wasn't getting at home. One afternoon, we ended up sitting together at the park after a neighborhood cleanup event. I was venting about James's long work hours, and Matt listened intently, nodding in all the right places. "You deserve someone who appreciates you," he said, his voice soft but firm. The way he looked at me in that moment, like I was the only person in the world, sent a spark through me. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just friendly concern. But deep down, I couldn't deny the way it made me feel. Days turned into weeks, and our conversations became more frequent, more intimate. I found myself checking my phone for his messages, looking forward to his witty comments and compliments. When he'd text me, "Good morning," I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. Guilt gnawed at me, but I rationalized it as harmless. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Not yet. Besides, James barely noticed me anymore. What was the harm in a little flirtation? The first real warning sign came one evening when James came home early from work. I was sitting on the couch texting Matt, and I didn't hear James walk in. "Who are you texting?" he asked casually, but there was an edge to his voice. "New one," I said too quickly, locking my phone and setting it aside. James's eyes lingered on me for a moment before he shrugged and walked into the kitchen. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I was doing, or what I was on the verge of doing. But the pull of Matt's attention was magnetic, and I wasn't ready to let it go. A few nights later, James surprised me with dinner reservations at a restaurant we used to frequent. He seemed genuinely excited to spend time together, but the conversation was stilted. It was as though we were two strangers pretending to be a couple. He asked about my day, and I gave polite but vague answers. When he reached across the table to take my hand, I forced a smile, but all I could think about was how Matt would have made me laugh, how he would have looked at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the room. I wanted to feel guilty for comparing them, but I didn't. Then came the moment I'll never forget, the moment that should have been my wake-up call. James looked me in the eye and said, "I know things have been tough lately. I want us to get back to how we used to be. Just tell me what you need." For a split second, I thought about coming clean, about confessing how neglected and invisible I felt, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "I just need time." James nodded, squeezing my hand. "Whatever it takes, I'm here." But was he? That night, as I lay awake in bed next to him, I made the choice that would change everything. I texted Matt, "I can't stop thinking about you." His reply came almost instantly, "Come over tomorrow." And just like that, the line between right and wrong blurred beyond recognition. The next day was a whirlwind of anticipation, guilt, and reckless excitement. I told myself this wasn't about falling out of love with James. It was about filling the void I'd been drowning in for years. Rationalizations tumbled through my mind as I prepared to meet Matt. A spritz of perfume, the blouse James once said was his favorite, and one last look in the mirror. "It's just one time," I whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it true. Matt's house, with its dark shutters and perfectly trimmed lawn, had always seemed so ordinary. But as I pulled into his driveway that afternoon, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, it felt like forbidden territory. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the front door, wondering if I could still turn back. But then Matt opened the door, leaning casually against the frame, his confident smirk pulling me in like a magnet. "You came," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His voice was smooth, warm, and reassuring in a way that made my knees weak. I felt a flush creep up my neck as I stepped inside, the scent of his cologne, woodsy and intoxicating, filling the air. "Should I have?" I asked, my voice shaky. He closed the door behind me and stood closer than he needed to. "You're here, aren't you?" I nodded, my breath hitching as his hand grazed my arm. He led me into the living room where sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the walls. It felt surreal, like I was stepping into a dream. Or a nightmare, depending on how this ended. We sat on the couch, a cautious distance between us at first. He poured me a glass of wine, his fingers brushing against mine as he handed it over. "Relax," he said, his voice low and soothing. But how could I relax? My heart was pounding in my chest, a mix of adrenaline, fear, and something I hadn't felt in years: desire. Our conversation started innocently enough. We talked about work, about life, about all the things James and I used to talk about before silence became our new normal. But the tension between Matt and me was palpable, a charged current neither of us could ignore. "You deserve more, you know," Matt said suddenly, his gaze locking onto mine. I swallowed hard, his words hitting me in a place I'd buried for too long. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, his hand resting lightly on my knee. "I mean, you deserve someone who sees you, someone who can't stop thinking about you, someone who makes you feel alive." His words were a lifeline, pulling me out of the emptiness I'd been drowning in. Without thinking, I leaned forward, and before I could stop myself, our lips met. The kiss was electric, igniting something deep within me that I thought had long since died. His hands tangled in my hair, and for the first time in years, I felt wanted. It escalated quickly, as if we'd both been holding back for too long. Clothes fell to the floor in a blur of motion, and we found ourselves in his bedroom where passion replaced reason. The details of what happened next are etched into my memory, not just because of the physical connection, but because of how it made me feel. Desired, adored, and, for a fleeting moment, free. But that fleeting moment didn't last long. As I lay tangled in the sheets, my head resting on Matt's chest, the sound of a car door slamming jolted us both upright. My heart dropped into my stomach as Matt's face turned pale. "Who's that?" I whispered, panic setting in. Matt didn't answer, but the answer came quickly enough. The front door opened and heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. "Matt, you home?" a deep voice called out. My blood ran cold. It was James. In a flurry of panic, I scrambled to gather my clothes, my hands trembling so badly that I struggled to pull my blouse over my head. Matt stood frozen, his face a mix of shock and fear. "Was he here?" I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Matt said, his voice cracking. But it was too late. The bedroom door swung open, and there he stood, James, my husband, the man I had betrayed. The look on his face was one I'll never forget. His usually calm, steady demeanor was replaced with a storm of emotions, disbelief, anger, and a pain so deep it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I should have known," he said quietly, his voice eerily calm. "I had my suspicions, but I didn't want to believe it." "James," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Just don't." He turned his gaze to Matt, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "You," James said, his tone icy. "You're supposed to be my friend, my neighbor, and this is what you do?" Matt stammered, trying to find words, but James didn't give him the chance. "Save it," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're not worth my time." Then he looked back at me, his eyes filled with a mix of betrayal and sadness. "I hope it was worth it," he said, his words cutting through me like a knife. Before I could say anything, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen in place, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me like a tidal wave. Matt tried to reach for me, but I pulled away, grabbing my things and bolting out the door. I wanted to chase after James, to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, but I knew it was too late. As I drove home, tears streamed down my face. The reality of what I'd done hit me like a freight train. I had destroyed everything. My marriage, my life, my sense of self. All for a fleeting moment of passion. But the worst was yet to come. When I arrived home, James's car was gone, and so was he. His clothes, his belongings, everything had been cleared out. The house, once filled with memories of us, now felt like a hollow shell. On the kitchen counter, I found a single envelope with my name on it. Inside was a note, written in James's neat, familiar handwriting. "You made your choice. Now live with it." The days following James's departure were unbearable. The house felt empty, each room echoing with memories of what we once had. I reached out to him, leaving voicemails, sending texts, pleading for a chance to talk. But James didn't respond. It was as if I no longer existed to him. Then, a week later, the confrontation I both dreaded and longed for finally came. It was late in the evening when I heard the front door open. My heart raced as James walked in, his presence filling the space with an unfamiliar coldness. He wasn't the man I remembered. His suit was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression unreadable. He held a folder in his hand, and as he placed it on the kitchen counter, the sound felt louder than it should have. "James," I began, my voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." He held up a hand, silencing me. "No. You had your chance to talk, to be honest, to fix this before it ever got to where it did. Now, it's my turn." I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting in knots. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with venom. "Did you think you could sneak around with him and I'd just keep working late, oblivious, while you played house with another man?" "It wasn't like that," I stammered, tears welling in my eyes. "I was lonely. I didn't know how to tell you how I felt." "And you thought cheating was the solution?" he shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "You humiliated me, in our home with someone I trusted. Do you even understand the damage you've caused?" "I made a mistake," I whispered, the words choking me. "I regret it more than you could ever know." James laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Regret doesn't undo betrayal, and it sure as hell doesn't rebuild trust." He slid the folder across the counter toward me. "Divorce papers," he said, his voice hollow. I've already signed them. I suggest you do the same." The room spun, my breath catching in my throat. "James, please," I begged, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the counter. "Don't do this. We can work through it. We can fix this. I'll do anything." His eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of the man I once knew. But it was fleeting. "You already had your chance to fix this," he said, his tone resolute. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "I loved you," he said quietly, his voice breaking ever so slightly. "But I can't love someone who doesn't respect me." As the door closed behind him, the finality of his words shattered me. I sank to the floor, sobbing, the weight of my actions crushing me. James was gone, and so was the life I had taken for granted. The days after James left were agonizing. The silence in the house was suffocating, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. The man who used to fill the space with his presence, his laughter, and even the quiet companionship of late-night dinners was gone. His absence was louder than anything I'd ever experienced. I spent hours replaying our final conversation in my head, picking apart every word he said and every plea I made. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left them, a tangible symbol of the destruction I'd caused. I couldn't bring myself to sign them, as though leaving them untouched would somehow keep the door open for reconciliation. But James had made his decision, and now I had to live with mine. The first real blow came at work. My boss called me into his office one afternoon, his expression grim. "We've heard some troubling things," he began, his words careful, as if he didn't want to push too hard. "Your personal life has become a topic of discussion, and it's starting to reflect poorly on the company." I felt the blood drain from my face. James had kept his promise to make me live with the consequences of my actions. Through whispers in our shared social circles, the story of my affair had spread like wildfire. The respect I'd built over years in my career was crumbling beneath the weight of judgment. "I don't see how my personal life is relevant to my work," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed. "It's not, in theory. But you know how these things go. The optics matter. I'm afraid we'll have to let you go." Losing my job felt like hitting rock bottom. It wasn't just the financial blow, it was the humiliation, the sense of losing yet another piece of my identity. I was no longer a respected professional, no longer the perfect wife, no longer anything but a woman drowning in the aftermath of her mistakes. I turned to Matt, thinking he might offer some support, but he was nowhere to be found. After James confronted us, Matt had distanced himself, his flirtatious charm replaced by cold indifference. When I finally worked up the courage to text him, his reply was curt. "This has gotten too messy. I think it's best we don't see each other anymore." It was the ultimate irony. The man I had risked everything for wasn't willing to risk anything for me. The isolation was unbearable. Friends who used to call or invite me out now avoided me, their loyalty firmly with James. Even my family was hesitant to offer comfort, their disappointment evident in every conversation. "You made your bed," my sister had said during one particularly tense phone call. "Now you have to lie in it." With no job, no husband, and no one to turn to, I spent my days in a haze of regret and self-loathing. I tried to find distractions, cleaning the house, running errands, anything to keep my mind occupied, but every quiet moment brought the same thoughts. How did I let it get this far? One evening, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt, hoping it might be James, but it was an email notification. It was from him, but it wasn't the olive branch I'd been hoping for. The email was cold and direct. "I'll be finalizing the divorce paperwork next week. If you don't sign by then, my attorney will proceed without your agreement. This isn't a negotiation." Attached was a detailed list of assets, splitting everything down to the last penny. He had been fair, more than fair considering what I'd done, but that didn't make it any easier to face. I stared at the screen, tears blurring my vision. The weight of it all pressed down on me, threatening to crush what little strength I had left. I realized that I couldn't keep clinging to the hope that James would come back. He was moving on, and if I wanted to survive this, I had to find a way to move on too. The next morning, I signed the divorce papers. It felt like closing a chapter of my life that I wasn't ready to let go of, but I knew it was the right thing to do. James deserved closure, even if it left me feeling hollow. But signing the papers wasn't enough. I needed to rebuild my life, not just for me, but to prove to James, to myself, to everyone, that I wasn't defined by my mistakes. I started small, taking a part-time job at a local boutique to pay the bills. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. The routine gave me structure, and the interaction with customers reminded me that I still had something to offer. Therapy became my lifeline. My sessions were raw and painful, forcing me to confront the insecurities and patterns that had led me down the path of infidelity. I had to face the uncomfortable truth. The affair wasn't just about James neglecting me. It was about my own inability to communicate, to express my needs, to face problems head-on instead of seeking escape. In time, I began to feel a glimmer of hope. I started volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others. I reconnected with old friends who weren't part of our shared social circle, people who knew me before James and could see beyond the scandal. The hardest part was accepting that I might never get the chance to apologize to him in person. I wrote him a letter, pouring out everything I couldn't say before. I told him how sorry I was, how much I regretted hurting him, and how I hoped he could find happiness, even if it wasn't with me. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't feel I had the right to. But I needed him to know I was taking responsibility for my actions. I mailed the letter, not expecting a response. And I didn't get one, but that was okay. The act of writing it was cathartic, a way of letting go. Months turned into a year, and while the pain of losing James never fully went away, I learned to live with it. I found new ways to define myself, not as a wife or an ex-wife or a woman who had made mistakes, but as someone who was trying to be better. One day, as I was walking through the park, I saw James from a distance. He was sitting on a bench, laughing with a woman who had a warm, kind smile. They looked happy together. It hurt, of course it did, but it also gave me a sense of peace. James had moved on, and maybe, one day, I would too. For now, all I could do was keep putting one foot in front of the other, rebuilding a life I could be proud of. Sitting on my porch one quiet evening, I looked out at the world beyond my front yard. The sun dipped low, casting golden hues over the trees, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air. It was peaceful, but the peace didn't reach me entirely. It was hard to let go of the heaviness that lingered deep within me, a constant reminder of the choices that had brought me here. It had been a year since James walked out of my life, and not a day went by when I didn't think about him. Sometimes it was a fleeting thought, a memory of our mornings together when he'd hand me my coffee, his smile sleepy but warm. Other times, it was a crushing weight, like when I passed by the Italian restaurant where we celebrated our anniversaries, or when I saw couples holding hands, laughing like we used to. But time had a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain. It wasn't that I didn't hurt anymore, but the pain had evolved. It wasn't raw and unbearable. It was quieter, an ache that I'd learned to live with. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who thought she was invincible. I had taken so much for granted. James's love, his dedication, the stability we had built together. I had let myself believe that just because he wasn't perfect, he didn't care. And in my search for something more, I had destroyed the very foundation of my happiness. My therapist once told me, people don't cheat because they stop loving their partner. They cheat because they stop loving themselves. At first, I rejected that idea. It seemed too simplistic, too neat. But the more I delved into my past, the more I realized how true it was. I had been so consumed by my own insecurities, my own feelings of inadequacy, that I sought validation outside of my marriage. I needed someone to remind me that I was desirable, that I mattered. But in the end, what I really needed was to look in the mirror and see my own worth. I began to understand that what happened with Matt wasn't just a betrayal of James, it was a betrayal of myself. I had compromised my values, my integrity, and my sense of self for a fleeting moment of affirmation. And while I could sit here and blame James for not noticing me, not making me feel special, the truth was, the responsibility was mine to bear. The letter I wrote to James a few months ago had been a turning point. I hadn't expected him to respond, and he hadn't, but writing it forced me to confront my actions head on, to stop hiding behind excuses or justifications. In that letter, I poured out every ounce of regret and remorse I had. I told him how sorry I was for betraying him, for taking his love for granted, and I wished him happiness. Not as a hollow sentiment, but as a genuine hope that he would find the joy I had stolen from him. I thought writing that letter would bring closure, and in some ways it did, but closure wasn't what I expected it to be. It wasn't a clean break, a neat ending to the mess I had made. Closure, I realized, wasn't about forgetting or moving on without pain. It was about learning to carry the pain differently, to let it transform you into someone better. That transformation wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like a battle, against shame, against self-doubt, against the urge to give up. But the small victories began to add up. Getting a job at the boutique had been humbling. I went from managing teams and sitting in corporate meetings to folding clothes and helping customers find the right size. At first, it felt like a step backward, a reminder of how far I'd fallen. But over time, I started to see it differently. I found pride in doing a good job, no matter how small the task. I found joy in the kindness of strangers, in the simple act of making someone's day better. Volunteering at the shelter became my sanctuary. It reminded me that no matter how broken I felt, I still had the power to help others. Whether it was serving meals or listening to someone's story, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. It gave me perspective, too, reminding me that my mistakes, while devastating, weren't the end of the world. One of the hardest parts of this journey was learning to forgive myself. It felt selfish at first, even indulgent, to think I deserved forgiveness after everything I'd done. But my therapist pushed me to see that self-forgiveness wasn't about absolving myself of guilt. It was about accepting that I couldn't change the past, only learn from it. "I'm not asking you to let go of the guilt entirely," she said during one session. "Guilt is what keeps us accountable. But shame is what keeps us stuck. And you don't deserve to be stuck forever." It was a slow process, untangling guilt from shame, learning to hold myself accountable without letting the weight of my mistakes crush me. But day by day, I began to see myself as more than just the woman who cheated, the woman who ruined her marriage. I began to see myself as someone who was trying. The moment I saw James in the park with that woman, my heart broke all over again. But there was something different about the pain this time. It wasn't just sadness or regret. It was also relief. Seeing him happy, Seeing him move on gave me permission to do the same. That night, I sat on my porch with a notebook in my lap. I started writing, not to James this time, but to myself. I wrote about the woman I wanted to be, not the perfect wife, not the perfect anything, but someone who was kind, honest, and unafraid to face her own flaws. Someone who could take responsibility for her actions without letting them define her entirely. As I closed the notebook and looked out at the fading light, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that I could rebuild, even if it wasn't the life I once had. Hope that I could find joy again, even if it came in smaller, quieter moments. Hope that one day I might look back on this chapter of my life not with regret, but with gratitude for the lessons it taught me. Because in the end, the only way to honor the love I lost was to become someone who could truly value it, someone who wouldn't take it for granted again. The year rolled on, and with it came the subtle shifts that signaled a new chapter in my life. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when I stopped waking up with a heavy heart, but one morning I realized the ache in my chest had dulled to something I could live with. Grief was still there, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it sat quietly in the background, a companion I had learned to coexist with. I focused on rebuilding myself step by step. The boutique job that once felt like a step down had turned into something I cherished. My coworkers became my friends, their laughter and camaraderie helping to mend parts of me I thought were irreparably broken. Customers who returned week after week became familiar faces, and their kindness reminded me of the goodness in the world. For the first time in years, I felt capable, useful, and proud of the work I did, no matter how small it might seem. The volunteering at the shelter had also become a constant in my life. I began mentoring women who were trying to start over, sharing what little wisdom I had gained from my own mistakes. They didn't judge me for my past. Instead, they saw me as someone who understood their struggles, and in helping them, I found pieces of myself that I thought I had lost forever. But the true test of my growth came on a day I hadn't anticipated, a chance meeting that would force me to confront everything I had been working toward. I was at the park, walking along the winding path that led through the rose garden, when I saw him. James. He was sitting on a bench with the same woman I had seen him with months ago. They were laughing, her hand resting gently on his arm. They looked comfortable together, like two people who had found their rhythm, their joy. For a moment I froze. My instinct was to turn and leave, to avoid the situation entirely. But something stopped me. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago, and running away wouldn't change anything. So I took a deep breath and walked toward them. James saw me first. His laughter faded, replaced by a look I couldn't quite read, surprise, perhaps, or maybe something softer. The woman followed his gaze, and her expression shifted to curiosity as she looked at me. I smiled, though it felt shaky, and offered a small wave. "Hi, James," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in my chest. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were processing the moment. "Hi," he replied. There was no anger in his tone, no bitterness, just a calm neutrality that both comforted and saddened me. "I didn't mean to interrupt," I said, glancing at the woman. I wanted to say hello." The woman stood as well, extending her hand with a warm smile. "You must be Claire," she said. "I've heard a little about you." Her words caught me off guard, but I shook her hand and returned her smile. "Yes, I'm Claire. And you are—" "Emma," she said. "It's nice to meet you." Emma. The name suited her. Soft, approachable, and kind. I could see why James had chosen her. She seemed to radiate the kind of warmth that could heal wounds, the kind of presence that reminded you of home. "I'll give you two a moment," Emma said, stepping back with an understanding nod. She wandered a few paces away, giving us space but remaining within view. James and I stood there, an awkward silence settling between us. I searched his face, looking for signs of anger or resentment, but all I saw was the man I had once loved, the man I still loved, in a way, though it was a love that had changed. It was no longer possessive or desperate. It was the love of someone who wished for another's happiness, even if it wasn't with them. "You seem happy," I said finally, breaking the silence. "She seems lovely." "She is," he replied, his tone gentle. She's been good for me." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm glad. You deserve that." He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "And you? How are you doing?" The question caught me off guard. For so long, I had assumed he didn't care anymore, that I was a chapter of his life he wanted to forget. But the concern in his voice was genuine, and it brought a sting of tears to my eyes. "I'm doing better," I said honestly. "It's been hard, but I've been working on myself, trying to make amends, even if it's just with myself." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's good. I'm glad to hear that." There was so much more I wanted to say, but I knew this wasn't the time or place. Instead, I looked at him and said the words that had been on my heart for so long. "I'm sorry, James, for everything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know how deeply I regret it. You didn't deserve any of it." He let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I know, Claire, and I've forgiven you. It took time, but I had to let go of the anchor. It wasn't doing me any good." His forgiveness hit me like a wave, washing over the guilt and shame I had carried for so long. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me something I hadn't expected: peace. We stood there for a moment longer, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally, James glanced over at Emma, who was waiting patiently a few steps away. "I should get back," he said. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Take care of yourself, James." "You too, Claire." As he walked away, hand in hand with Emma, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, relief, and a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. I watched them disappear down the path, their laughter fading into the distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. Not from the pain, because that would always be a part of me, but from the chains of my own self-loathing. I had faced the consequences of my actions, and though I had lost so much, I had gained something too: strength, resilience, and the determination to be better. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, the sun warm on my face and the path stretching out before me. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.